Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be joining in this inaugural meeting of WARCnet. Thanks to Niels for allowing me to occupy one of the free seats as someone who is not formally a member of the network, and I look forward to interacting with you all online as we go on. My name is Peter Webster. I'm an independent scholar and consultant based in the UK, and I have a long-standing interest of 10 years now in the archived web, from both the collecting and the research points of view. And today I want to outline a potential problem for web archive studies. It isn't yet urgent, I don't think, but it may become increasingly so over the next few years. It's based on my observations of the scene in the UK, but I imagine it is more applicable more widely than that. And I have no grand plan to solve it, but I would hope that the project like WARCnet will be a good forum in which to start thinking about the issue. Judging by the titles on the programme, this meeting will have progressed roughly in the same order as Web Archive Studies itself developed over the last 10 to 15 years. Our first preoccupation in the early days was with web archives themselves, how it was they were made, who it was made them, and how we then went about gaining access to them. The second preoccupation that then developed was the kind of research questions we were likely to ask of these archives once we had access to them. In this meeting we've discussed events, and we've discussed the nation in the web. And events certainly were among the first collections that the National Library started to create. There's also been a progress in the last, say, 3 or 4 years in our thinking about method as well, from a close reading of single archived thing played back in a browser to the analysis of data at scale as well. And there's now also a publication infrastructure for web archive studies. We have a journal, Internet Histories. We have monographs on scope and method from Niels and from Ian Milligan. And we have a handbook, the Sage Handbook of Web History. And we're also, very encouragingly, beginning to see articles using web archives as a source appearing in mainstream journals across the various disciplines involved here. But there is a missing piece at the end of all this, I think, about data preservation and reuse, or research data management, as it's more usually known. And it's missing because of the history of web archive studies and because of the unique configuration of disciplines and institutions that are in play here. Were we, for example, physicists or astronomers, we would have a pretty clear idea about research data management. We would tend to be the makers of our own data, or at least have it made specifically for research purposes. Think here, for instance, of the Hubble Space Telescope or the Large Hadron Collider. And there's also a well-established pattern of making that data available to others in order that they may reproduce and verify our findings. And the management of that data tends either to be the business of the university in which the scholar is based, or at a discipline level in some way, via some kind of research data repository. However, if you ask a humanities scholar what they understand by the term repository, I expect they're more likely to say that it means a place for PDFs. It's a place for versions of publications that we're required to make available online on an open access basis. As far as I can see, in general, there's a very weak culture indeed in the humanities of sharing of research data, if indeed humanities scholars think about the things that they create as data at all. An anecdote here to make the point: I was one of the members of the advisory board of the new Journal for Open Humanities Data back in 2015. Now, that journal exists to publish short articles to accompany and promote open data sets for reuse. And I'm not breaking any confidences to say that the uptake of that was very limited, and still is. And that's not because there are other similar journals competing for the market. It's just a very limited demand. And the third part of this jigsaw are the national libraries, which have been a dominant force in European web archiving from the very beginning, more so than, say, in North America. And I make no criticism of the libraries here, speaking as a former member of staff of one of them, but they are, in general, well established, also old, indeed even ancient, sometimes enabled to do their work by a legal deposit law, often backed by public funds, and crucially, heavily focused on publications and things that look like publications. It's just in the DNA, this way of thinking. Recently, some of the national libraries, the British Library for instance, National Library of Luxembourg also, have begun to make data sets available for reuse. And this is great. I've used some of them myself from the BL. But these in general are derived from their own collections, largely. What the national libraries have not generally done is to think of their role as including the collection and management of research data that's produced elsewhere in the universities. And finally, and not least, reuse of data collected under legal deposit or derived from it is, as we know well, hedged around with all manner of restrictions and qualifications, usually embedded in the legal frameworks which are used to manage that work. And so there is now a proliferation of individual data repositories. There are hundreds, in fact. I counted something like 60 for biological sciences alone. Some of these are national, some of these are institutional from particular universities or research institutes. Some of them are aimed at whole subjects or disciplines. Some of them require a registration to use them, some of them do not. Some of them involve the payment of a fee to use data, some do not. Some of them are backed by public money, some of them are funded philanthropically. Some, a few, are intended to be universal, such as Zenodo or Figshare or Dryad, all three of which operate on slightly different bases and then funded in slightly different ways. And so it isn't clear to me where exactly the ideal home for web archive research data is in all of this. And so there is some systemic risk in this fragmented situation for us as scholars of web archives if the data we produce is dispersed across many repositories. And as the volume of web archive studies increases, and as we start to need and want to examine the data that we've all used to critique and build upon it, and this fragmentation may become more of an issue than it currently is. Now, as I said at the beginning, I don't have a solution to propose for this, and so you may indeed not agree that it's even a problem at all. However, if it is a problem, and I suspect that it is, then WARCnet must, I think, be a good place to start thinking about the solutions to it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this as we go on.